Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hey people, welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast where we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan and I do like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA. ASA is the Australasian Animal Studies Association. ASA holds a conference every 2 years. The next conference is coming up in New Zealand in 2019. I've already submitted my abstract and I've already been accepted to speak at the conference, so I'll be there. It's going to be absolutely fantastic. I hope you can join us also. Now's the time to start planning, get your abstract in, and also start thinking about how you're going to fund the trip out to New Zealand. But it's going to be absolutely fantastic, so I hope to see you at the 2019 ASA conference. This episode is also brought to you by MC Pony. Now, MC Pony is my friend Elizabeth Usher. She very, very kindly came up with the theme music for this podcast, which I think you will all agree is very catchy. MC Pony is a very committed animal person, very, very interested in trying to bring about positive change for animals. She has a lot of songs, a lot of music at her Vegan Enthused website, all about animals, and I encourage you to check it out. So check out MC Pony and enjoy some animal-inspired music. Okay, now this episode of Knowing Animals once again is coming to you from Leeds. We're inside this time, so a little bit of a different recording environment, and I'm very lucky to be joined by Caitlin Stobie. Caitlin is a PhD student in the School of English at the University of Leeds, and today we're going to discuss Caitlin's article, The Good Wife, Sibling Species in Kang's the Vegetarian, which appeared in ISLE, Interdisciplinary Studies in Literature Environment in 2018. Goodness me, that was a mouthful. Welcome to the podcast, Caitlin.
Thanks so much, Siobhan. I really enjoy your podcast and it's a pleasure to be on here.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind of you to say. So, Caitlin, what inspired this work?
It's a bit of a long story, as I'm sure a lot of people say. But so I was writing my master's dissertation at the University of Kent, and I knew that I wanted to work on post-colonial animal studies. This was something I'd worked on from my undergraduate degree. And I was interested in Southern African literature. My supervisor at the time was Dr. Derek Ryan, who's worked on animals in Virginia Woolf mostly. So we were kind of speaking about what I was going to be focusing on in these Southern African texts and why specifically I was looking at South Africa. So other than the obvious reason of my accent. So he started suggesting that I read around the topic, and I suppose this is quite unusual for literary scholars in that people normally will read a text and think, wow, that's really interesting how they speak about the animal that way, let me write an article about it. Whereas with me, I was kind of thinking, I need a book to say what it is that I'm thinking here. I was literally Googling words. That was the level of desperation I was reaching. And then I came across a title, The Vegetarian. And it was a book that had just been translated into English. This was late 2015, I think. So it'd just been translated, but had actually been written 10 years previously by Kang, who's a South Korean author. So immediately got my hands on the book and devoured it. And it was perfect for my dissertation, which was essentially wanting to look at veganism from a post-colonial angle. I think that post-humanism, animal studies in general, even critical animal studies, sometimes misses the mark when it comes to post-colonial issues. And I was wondering how literature could address this, or maybe provide us with a theory that might differ from the ones that are predominantly distributed. So the novel essentially found me, or I found it. It was a weird thing. So then I went to a vegan theory conference at the University of Oxford, which I'm sure you're familiar with. So people there were Bob McKay, Richard Twine, Laura Wright, and Laura suggested that I submit this part of the dissertation for a special issue on vegan studies in ISLE. I'm not going to repeat the full name of the journal. So that's really how it came about. And I suppose more broadly speaking about how it is that I think literary studies can help animal studies or vice versa, is that the text provides us with a way of thinking through the animal. And this is something I was very preoccupied with in the article as well, was trying to think of both the animal and the human, and how there might be similarities, but also importantly acknowledging differences at the same time. In post-colonial context, I think that's something that can be forgotten.
Wonderful. So the novel that you focus on is The Vegetarian. I have been told that it's a must-read, and I've even purchased a copy, but somehow I've not quite managed to read it, which probably sounds like a terrible thing to do, but perhaps is also understandable in our... I'm a flawed person. I want to, but I didn't quite do it yet. Can you tell us what it's about?
I'm not sure if I should give a content warning or a spoiler alert. Is that what they call it?
Yes.
But so spoiler alert for anyone who's listening. By the way, don't feel bad about not reading books. My book pile is terrible. It's actually interesting and very difficult to summarize, even though the title of the text is quite didactic, The Vegetarian, and it seems to be something self-explanatory, but actually the very title is misleading. So in South Korea, vegetarianism often is not what it seems. I've never been to South Korea, but in my research I learned that a lot of the times you will order something vegetarian and it will come with bone broth or some meat derivatives in the dish. There's also no word for vegan in South Korean. So the word vegetarian, or the title itself, is ambiguous. And the character is semi-vegan, mostly vegan, also suffering from an eating disorder. This was the first problem I encountered when reading the text, was that my friends read it, and some of their responses were, it's not about vegetarianism, it's about an eating disorder, specifically anorexia. And I kind of struggled thinking through that for a while and thought, how do we address the reality of mental illness in the text, but also think about animal ethics and the kind of autonomy that is trying to be expressed through the semi-veganism, vegetarianism of the main character. So essentially, it's divided into 3 mini novellas, as Kang says. And each one is looking at a specific vector of oppression, using Carol J. Adams and her legacy of ecofeminist thought quite extensively. So the similar treatment of female bodies and animal bodies, or I suppose non-human and human female bodies. There is the first section speaks about the relationship between the protagonist and her husband. Seems an abusive relationship almost. And this is the moment when she decides to go vegetarian. He doesn't understand this. Her family doesn't understand this. And the rest of the novel is trying to grapple with these kind of human barriers that vegetarians may face. I find that particularly interesting because I think if we're going to have a post-colonial post-humanism or a post-colonial vegetarianism even, we need to be very mindful of community and the way that people might be treated. I know Richard Twine has spoken about this as well, where one of the greatest barriers that a vegan faces in terms of maintaining one's veganism isn't access so much as attitudes from friends and family. So that's addressed in the first section of the novella. The second section becomes a bit weirder. The text gets increasingly weird. So don't do what I did. I gave it to my sister-in-law as a Christmas present. Didn't go down well. The second section speaks about her relationship with another male member of the family, this time her brother-in-law. And I don't want to give too much away with that because I think you actually just have to read it. The third section is then a kind of reaction to the second section where the main character is actually being hospitalized. And again, this is for both mental health and physical health. She's basically not eating at all. But the reasons for this I find really fascinating. And I think that it's, again, going over and above the kind of anorexic reading that some journalistic articles made after the book was translated into English. It's also interesting that there's a different reception of the novel in South Korea as opposed to in Western countries. And people in South Korea were actually quite offended by some of the word choices or supposed mistranslations of the text, which is really interesting.
Fascinating. One of the things, so we know that I've not read the novel, but I have read your paper. One of the things that strikes me as, a real novice, and as I was saying to you before we started recording, I find that papers in literature studies really push me to think in new ways. So I'm kind of, I'm grappling. But it strikes me that there aren't really animals in this novel. And so to what extent can a book that doesn't include animals illuminate the lives of animals?
That's a great question, and actually one that was posed to me by one of my friends who's also working in animal studies. He basically said to me, there aren't enough real animals in the text. I disagree. And perhaps the moments that I focused on in the article are moments where both humans and animal symbolism are present. There is a lot of symbolism, for example, of specific parts of an animal. So I think something I mentioned in the article is the white wing that is actually on the cover of one of the latest editions of the novel. There are also dogs. Very interesting kind of early trauma with a dog that then informs the character's vegetarianism and her relationship with her father, who abused the dog. So there are domestic animals mostly in the text, but it's an urban setting as well. I find when I encounter this question, which as a literary scholar is quite often, I think that the most important thing is to think about, for me always, what metaphor can do and how we might not necessarily have an actual animal's perspective or an actual animal as a character or in the foreground, but how nevertheless an animal can inform the way we metaphorize and therefore understand the world. Both human and non-human interactions as well, I think, are encompassed by texts. And if a mainly human interaction is using interesting verbs that might apply only to animals, that's when we get something really messy and I think interesting. It's unstabilizing that idea of the human as being rational, as being completely exclusive from animal movement or minds. I hope, does that answer the question?
It does. And do you think the author was thinking about these issues at all when writing?
I definitely do. Having read her later work, that was another thing, is that there'd been this 10-year gap between the initial publication of the text and its translation. So in the interim, she'd been working on other work, and she's since published 2 novels. Well, one is a novel and one is more of a short story collection. And while both of them aren't explicitly dealing with animals, again, there's this kind of recurrence of animal imagery and also a preoccupation on suffering in any form. So Human Acts, which is the title of the next novel after this, is looking at the Gwangju uprising in South Korea. But over and over again, you get this kind of rendering of human bodies as animalistic. And once again, I think that is something that is really fascinating. I've read interviews with her as well, where there's this kind of this urge towards unsettling humanism.
So you also talk about gender and link it to the animal rights movement. Can you tell listeners what links you see there?
So many. This would be if there's anything to really glean from this article, it would be definitely the gendered element of what's being discussed. And actually what the title of something else that I've been working on is looking at sibling species and deliberately trying to move past the idea of brother or sister and thinking about oppressions in various forms and how we might move ecofeminism beyond its kind of essentialist iterations. So for those who aren't too familiar, ecofeminism would be finding links between the treatment of, well, I suppose a naturalization of certain superiors over others because of their identities in terms of race, sex, class, species, nationality, trying to literally naturalize otherness. So there are obviously intersectional links there, and I suppose that ecofeminism would be pushing those intersectional links into the non-human realm. that's something that's always fascinated me and that I've wanted to work through in my discussion of texts. And I think that this text in particular is interesting because it never loses sight of the human, but it's rendering the human in these bizarre non-human ways. And perhaps that gives us a way to challenge gender inequality, because as you will know, there's a lot of work still to be done, and we seem to be hitting against a wall. And when I say we, I mean feminists. There seems to be this impossible barrier, and perhaps if we start to think through our own human identities and what they mean and how we might be replicating certain vectors of privilege, that could be interesting.
So do you see consideration of what we might consider animal studies or non-human animal issues as also being a pathway to illuminate the human condition, understand the human condition better?
I do. The human condition is... I find the problem essentially for me is that I think it's a tricky ground as a humanities scholar, essentially, because we want to speak about animals, we want to talk about the animal realm, but a problem that I often encounter, and I assume you've probably also encountered, is, for example, funding bodies saying, why should we care? And this might be specifically for literary studies. I think it's a problem because you already have to justify why it is that people should care about reading a book that's fictional. Then you have the even harder problem of a fictional animal. It's not even a real animal. Why should people care? And I think that if people would be a lot more inclined towards caring if they realized that this treatment of animals doesn't just affect, it's not purely about some abstract nature or the natural realm. It's also about human rights and human concerns, the lives of humans. I mean, environmental racism, for example, there are these clear links that are just neatly sidestepped quite often. So I'd like to bring those to attention.
Wonderful. Well, Caitlin, I ask everyone who comes on Knowing Animals to answer 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
I am.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
So there are 2 answers. I know this happens a lot. The first I probably read unwillingly was Peter Singer. I had a tutor for philosophy who was quite insistent that we would read pro-vegetarian articles, which actually came in handy. But the first person or the first pro-animal scholar I actively sought out would definitely be Carol J. Adams because of that famous title.
Fantastic. Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
It's also a bit of a difficult question because I've been writing essays, for example, from my undergraduate degree on animal studies or animals and texts. Technically, this is my first published piece on animal studies as such. I've had another piece published which was more looking at monsters, I suppose, and the monstrous. So let's go with this one.
Fantastic. Brilliant. If you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
I think most recently, and certainly in the article that I wrote, Claire Jean Kim has been fascinating. So Dangerous Crossings, Race, Species and Nature in a Multicultural Age, that was really important and powerful in a lot of ways, just looking at all these intersections that we've been discussing and trying to never lose sight of one specific aspect.
Fantastic. So what's the most important thing academics can do for animals?
I think, and this is going to be answering as a literary critic, I think we have to take the actual animal seriously. And by that I mean mainly stop talking about anthropomorphism and whether or not that's a problem. So a discussion that I often hear at animal studies conferences or events is kind of, oh, well, this character is an animal, but that's just anthropomorphism, and it's kind of brushed away. I don't think that's actually an interesting point to make, and I don't think it helps us in any way. I think it would be a lot more interesting if we took the animal at face value and then started working with what it is that the animal is conveying. Metaphorically, again, I think it's always important to think about the kind of symbolism behind what is being said or how it's being conveyed and through what or who.
Fantastic. So if you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
I'm inclined to think that people might answer this question by saying, for example, stop eating animals. I'm on one hand want to say that, but what I actually think I would want is for people to stop using the word rights. I think, speaking now as a post-humanist, and again going back to that earlier conversation about feminism and ecofeminism and how we might, move forwards, I think that rights rhetoric isn't helping us in a lot of ways. And talking about animal rights in particular, it works up to a certain point, but there are still challenges that we're facing since, how long have we been speaking about rights and whether or not certain beings should have rights and to what extent? And I frankly think that we could come up with maybe some more useful terminology.
There we go. So, Caitlin, what are you working on next?
So, actually, I have something else coming out that's also being edited by Laura Wright. And that's a collection called Doing Vegan Studies, Textual Ethics and Lived Activism. And it's from University of Nevada Press. So the chapter that I have in that book is the other half of my master's dissertation, which is looking at the situational ethics that I'm alluding to in this article in a South African author's work.
Oh, wonderful. And how can people find out more about your work?
The regular academia.edu, I think, and also Twitter. And if people are in or around Leeds and would like to check out the Leeds Animal Studies Network, we also have a Twitter page.
Oh, fantastic. Do you want to give it your Twitter handle?
Sure. Mine is at Caitlin Stobie, and then at Leeds Animal Net is the other one.
Fantastic. Well, Caitlin, thank you so much for coming on Knowing Animals, and thank you to the listeners for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter. You can follow me personally at SO_S. We also have a Facebook account for Knowing Animals. I have a Facebook account at Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan, and we've also got an Instagram account. But out of all those things, the most important thing is to leave a review at iTunes, because reviews make it easier for other people to find the podcast and to find out about animals. I'm Siobhan O'Sullivan, and I do like knowing animals.